Hey everybody, it's 1 minute till 8, so if you don't mind, we're going to start on time, so please make your way to your seats and we'll hopefully find a quorum. You don't have to stop talking yet, I'm just giving you an idea of what we're looking for. Hey, good morning. Welcome to the Senate Appropriations meeting. Today, 8:01, I'm a minute behind, on February 24th, as we now are going to discuss the AFY 25 budget. Senator Dixon, do you mind doing an invocation?
Not all, Mr. Chairman. Everyone, please bow your head. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you for this blessed day. Lord, I pray for wisdom and guidance over this committee as we do this important work with the budget. I pray that you keep our servicemen and women serving here and abroad. Keep a hedge of protection around them and bring the ones that are serving abroad home safely. In Jesus' loving name I pray. Amen.
Thank you, Senator. First order of business, since it's our first meeting of 2025, I need a motion to approve the rules. They're in your, they're in your folder if you want to talk about them. Any seconds? Motion and a second. We'll go Beach and Dolezal. Any further discussion on the rules? Same rules I think we've had for the past 23 years. All those in favor, please say aye. Opposed? Thank you. Next item of business is the AFY 25 budget. I need a copy of yours to tell which number it is. Senate 67, I apologize. I didn't have the actual LC number in front of me. House Bill 67 from Chairman Speaker Burns, carried by Chairman Hatchett, is the state's AFY 25 budget. Amended budgets give us a time to true up and restructure our priorities, and after this state's 4 major storms last year, I think you see why we needed to do so. The state's also continued to grow. We have our infrastructure taxed, and you'll see that the health of our community as our state continues to grow older becomes more and more important as well. These items, combined with the formulaic true-ups that we do every year, are really going to be what ends up creating the AFY 25 budget that you see in House Bill 67. Ag is our state's main industry. You know it drives so much for our economy. Forestry does as well. It drives small towns. The loss of a mill is devastating for an area 50 miles or wider in radius. So the state's $4 billion that you'll see in this AFY 25 budget are going to support ag. They're going to support forestry. They're going to support individuals, people who may not be in ag or forestry. They're also going to support those other items I already mentioned about the growth of our state, our infrastructure, its health, and other public safety priorities that you've seen discussed in this building. I want to first say thanks to Chairman Hatchett. We have to get together early in the year working with Leader Gooch and then Leader Evstration to try to get an idea on how the session will play out, and a lot of it's driven timing-wise by the budget. It takes so much time to present the budget, get it right, and then move it through committee. And Chairman Hatchett, so we know generally when they're going to pass the budget each year, and Chairman Hatchett was able to get it to us right on time to help us see it early, sharing his visions for what they thought was important for our state, and hopefully, thanks to that, we're going to be able to get it back to them 1, if not 2 days early this year to stay on track. I also want to thank Rick Dunn and his folks at OPB. They started back in September before the storm talking to us about this. Obviously, we made a lot of changes in October and November. But this is not a document that comes to you after only 3 weeks of review. It's one that comes to you with almost 6 months of preparation. Last and certainly not least, I want to thank members of this body. You know, we had some plans laid out to talk about important matters that some of that we've already discussed before session began. And then, of course, the first week of session during budget week. But, ironically, due to storms, those plans had to change. And you as subcommittee members, subcommittee chairs, doubled down your time, and I want to tell you thank you for helping us get back on track and getting to where we are today. As I mentioned, the Senate knew before session that the storms of 2024 would have a major impact on our 2025 amended budget. That's why we set up a whole day of joint appropriations just to talk about the impacts of storm. As I've already said, ironically, that was canceled due to another storm, 4 inches of snow and ice across South and Middle Georgia. So again, the thanks to you subcommittee members for getting us to where we are. We couldn't have gotten here without you. The changes you'll see a lot of programs that have been reduced or eliminated. Those were done to create dollars for storm victims. The House did this exact same thing and created over $100 million in ag and timber relief. The Senate, you will see, will create $125 million in relief, $50 million for ag and timber, $50 million for a total of $82 million for local cleanup. It's been much discussed in the media. There's not right now we have 120 days to clean up after the storm, and FEMA will pay 100%. That 120 days expired February 3rd. The governor has already said that he's committed to paying the state and local portion of cleanup for at least the next 30 to 60 days. The estimate that the governor's office had on that was around $32 million. We think that number may be a little low. If we're wrong, great, it surpluses. But if we're right, the Senate budget will put $50 million more into that category for $82 million for local cleanup across South and East Georgia. The Senate will do something a little different as well in our budget. We're going to add $25 million for those who don't fall into any of the categories we've already mentioned. They don't fall into ag, they don't fall into timber, they don't fall into local governments. But they, nonetheless, through no fault of their own, have been awaiting insurance claims, or maybe they were denied coverage and are still sleeping with the only thing between their beds and the elements outside being a thin blue tarp they were given some 149 days ago. I believe that we owe them the same duty we do to our timber and our forestry industries. We're going to help people. So how do we do it? I told you we're going to reduce other programs. We felt storm relief was the most important and timely matter to address. So we used this amended budget to realign priorities and focus on getting help where it's needed most. A swath from Valdosta to Augusta that, regardless of our efforts, will never be made whole. When we started getting into these details, we started at home. You'll see that the Senate, we reduced one of our priorities. We had an ad for about $200,000. We pulled that. We're going to use that money for storm. We're going to comb agencies for savings for positions that haven't been filled or were filled late. We're going to use that money for storm. We're going to move yet-to-be-built projects across the state and use those funds now, much like Governor Kemp did immediately following the storm, and put those funds to use for recovery in South and East Georgia now. All of the Senate's changes, though, aren't cuts. We also moved to fund infrastructure and growth, as well as matters that are surrounding public safety, particularly those in our state prisons and due to other federal safety orders. Above all, we realize that the role of our government is to protect our citizens, our employees, those in custody, and those in the public at large. So let's get into the details. I told you that the Senate's going to reduce its budget on line 3.1. We'll pull out $273,000 from our own budget. We'll put that towards storm. We're going to agree with the House, where they took and pulled some monies out of the judicial branch to create space that we also then will use for storm. We're going to fund one of our, in the public, before I go there, the Prosecuting Attorneys Council, you'll see that there were monies they had for late ads of positions. We're going to reduce those funds for personnel and put another $2.1 million towards storm. In the Department of Administrative Services, there was a bill that the Senate passed last year that created an indemnity fund for our public safety officials who died due to COVID-19. The Senate will partially fund this ad at $3.5 million. In the Department of Technology, Georgia Department of Technology, the House had already reduced the governor's number by about $35 million. We're going to hold that dollar as well, send that for the items I've already discussed. But we do combine some other items that they placed in GTA back into one line on 48.1. That's not really any additional dollars. It's just combining the lines 48.2 and 3 and some others that you'll see later on in the budget that the House moved to other programs. Ag was not immune from our combing. We combed a few positions in Ag at line 50.1, but you'll see in line 500.1 the $50 million ad that I've already discussed towards timber and agriculture related to relief needed for Hurricane Helene. In the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities, the Senate was able to comb positions that were reduced due to a delayed start of the Macon Crisis Stabilization and Diagnostic Center, creating additional funding. And we use that funding to help what we think is going to be important during this time in our downtowns. It's not going to just be people who suffer. You'll see downtowns and small communities. And we use that $3 million to recapitalize the Downtown Development Revolving Loan Fund at line 83.1. I mentioned infrastructure early, and it's no secret that the growth of Southeast Georgia has been strong, and that's begun to tax our water infrastructure there. The House's budget and the governor's budget had 501, slightly more than 501 million for water infrastructure in Southeast Georgia. The Senate is going to agree with that ad. We then will take the remaining $250 million, separate that out, and $65 million of it into special funding initiatives, and then lock down a $200 million to make sure that those $200 million are spent in other areas of our state. We do want to support our friends and our growth in Southeast Georgia, but we want the remaining $200 million, we want to make sure that that is spent in the other corners of our state because we have growth needs and infrastructure needs in those as well. At the One Georgia Authority, you'll see on Senate budget line 86.3, the Senate puts that $25 million in that I discussed earlier. The House had 10. We add 15 to it. And make sure that this is used to engage our nonprofit community through grants for rebuilding and recovery efforts for victims of Hurricane Helene. We've talked a lot about ag, we've talked a lot about forestry, and we should do so. But we also need to remember that there's a lot of folks who don't fall into those two categories who are still trying to rebuild their lives. In the Department of Community Health, you'll see some changes that are due to the things I talked about in GTA, but we don't need to go through those in detail. The biggest change I think we made at the Department of Community Health is we reduced the House's budget at line 90.1. They had moved to fund paying a hospital provider fee for all the hospitals in Georgia due to Hurricane Helene and the efforts that those hospitals had made. We took and said, hey, if it's related to Hurricane Helene, we're going to narrow that scope, and instead of funding the hospital provider fee for every hospital in Georgia, we're going to fund it in one-time grants for those in the major disaster declaration area. In other words, that swath of South and East Georgia. That allowed us to create $20 million in additional savings to move more into storms. We also placed $100,000 right below that line item for our federally qualified health centers. We have 5 of them in this area of South and East Georgia that were affected by the storm, and that's not a ton of money, but it's also to show some solidarity with those FQHCs for the work that they did, and many times just the holes they're needing replacing their roof due to trees. In the ABD budget for Medicaid, you guys know that we fund the Medicaid program 1/3, 2/3, roughly. State funds 2/3, state funds 1/3, federal funds 2/3. The House had made an increase for inflation in that for ABD and skilled nursing facilities. The Senate pulls this money. The reason being is skilled nursing facilities are paid on a cost report. We would like to make sure we continue to pay them on that cost report. To fund inflation instead of the cost report could create a disincentive to continue to invest in one skilled nursing facility. We want to continue that investment, especially as private equity becomes more and more involved in the skilled nursing facility communities. In our healthcare workforce, you'll see $1.5 million to Colquitt Regional Medical Center. There was a $3 million ad in the House budget for PCOM, Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine. The Senate's going to half that, and then we're going to send those monies instead to that half to Colquitt Regional Medical Center. We also, as I mentioned to you, the state's population is aging. And while we are turning out more medical students than we ever have and creating more medical schools, you'll see that we are not retaining many of those after residency. The Senate's budget at line 98.4 makes a major investment of a little over $20 million to recruit and promote residencies in the areas below State Route 540. State Route 540 is the state's fall line freeway. We have seen a lot of concentration of our medical community north of that line. We have not seen nearly as much south of that line, and that becomes a problem over terms, because if we don't begin investment south of that line, then we're going to have a larger problem over the next 20 years. The Department of Community Supervision, there was some combing done for the purpose of creating space for storms. In our Department of Corrections budget, I need to say thank you first to Chairman Albers and to Jennifer Boger, who works in our office doing these line items. We've had a report from Bright House. You know we've had some issues at Corrections. The Bright House report was able to give us a plan. We were not able to get a lot of clarity on some of those items. They were proprietary. For things that we found to be proprietary or where they could not be explained in more detail, we had to comb those to make those make sense with our budget. The Senate overall is going to add, the House wanted to add 2 new modular units. The modular is a bad word to use here because they really are fixed structures. They're just built out of precast concrete. For additional space in our corrections community to allow us to begin addressing what we have, which is many, many broke locks. The governor had asked for 4. The Senate went to 3. We also take and pour extra monies, about $20 million more than you originally saw in the governor's budget, into salaries at our state prisons. We know that we're having a much better job recruiting and retaining, so that in the past where corrections was able to float their budget based upon vacancies, since we're now retaining those individuals, you're not able to float on vacancies, and we were able to increase the governor's ad of about $10 million to right at $30 million. We probably have some more space that we need to do there if we're able to do so in an agreement as amended or a conference committee. In other areas of our budget, we combed the Department of Economic Development again for positions and for contracts that were paid previously. At the state's Department of Education, there's not a ton of changes that we made overall. Again, some combing. We did move forward funding the governor's proposal of a building at the University of Augusta. We also moved forward to continue funding special needs scholarships at the numbers recommended by the governor, with a slight turning because we had a little bit more updated information. In the Department of Homeland Security, well, let's start first with the governor's office. In the governor's office at lines 173.1, you'll see he started with $150 million. The House took it to $145 million. That's because they moved $5 million out over to the Next Gen 911 Center at GEMA. We're going to support this too. We then took and pulled out the $32 million that was remaining, combine it with our $50 million, and set it on line 173.2. And those lines again should be to increase funds for state and local matches for debris removal of local roads and right-of-ways due to Hurricane Helene. At GEMA, I've already mentioned to you that we took and moved funds for the purpose of creating the Next Gen 911 system. In DHS, we made significant moves to try to align their programs based now that the federal public health pandemic orders have expired. We were able to comb some savings out of those line items now. because we do believe that the eligibility is beginning to return somewhat to normal. At the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, you'll see that and through other areas related in CJCC, you'll see that the Senate added back in the Macon Center as we deal with human trafficking. The House had just left in the Augusta Center. Those two centers together have seen over 50 instances of suspected human trafficking, and we think it's important that we get those up and running. The Senate did leave the House's money at Department of Natural Resources, and we also added $1.5 million for adaptive playground equipment concerning children with special needs. When you get to your bond package, skipping ahead a little bit, you'll see that the Senate is going to comb a lot of items related to vehicles. We're going to comb those back a little bit. We even did this in the area related to chicken and poultry, where we combed back a contract that we had previously with a vendor who we now pay for their vehicles. That's all just to create additional space, as we talked about for storm. We did, however, hold the public safety vehicle number. We're on a 5-year rotation where we replace cars. That's a program we've worked with them to build over years, and we didn't want to upset that apple cart since we finally got it rolling in the right direction. In USG, we made a few changes there, but again, most of those changes do not relate to anything that's dollar-wise substantial. We did add in funds for public libraries. We had several of them destroyed in the storm, so we did a one-time move to increase the materials grants at public libraries from 70 cents to $1. That's something they've been chasing for many, many years and wanting to get to. We fund libraries at 70 cents per the number of people in their area, and we hope that move to $1 allows them to get new roofs, patch holes, do things that they needed to do based to the storms they've dealt with. When you look at our grant programs under Georgia Student Finance, you'll see a lot of reductions. This is something the Senate does every year or every other year. All we did is true those up to need. Those are not reductions of the scholarships or to any individuals. However, a lot of our scholarship dollars go unclaimed and unused, so we trued those up and again creating additional dollars in for storm. At the Department of Transportation, there were some moves here. Local road assistance projects, as you know, the governor has mentioned that we're going to roll out essentially a double LMIG for this year. We're not going to put it in LMIG because the LMIG would require a 10% match. We put that money instead at LARP, the Local Road Assistance Program. The Senate plussed that up by $15 million. We plussed up rail by $830,000, which allows that to be fully funded. And we created these funds by coming into the Freight and Infrastructure Program, reducing their dollars by $30 million, but still leaving a $500 million increase in our Freight and Infrastructure Program. We plussed up the numbers from the House related to the Georgia Transportation Infrastructure Bank. Remember, this is an area where local governments can competitively bid for projects to move them forward that help their area. The governor had originally placed 60. The House had taken that down to 37. The Senate carried it back up to a little over 53. We think, again, for infrastructure purposes, that's a wise move to allow communities to build things they need to do, usually related to roads, to help move their traffic around more efficiently. 367.1 is probably one of the items I'm most proud about. For many, many years, starting back to the late Chairman Jack Hill, the Senate has funded the subacute therapy unit at our veterans nursing homes in Milledgeville. We've had a hard time getting that one stood up due to a lot of different factors. The Senate is going to add $2 million to our veterans nursing home for the stated and exclusive purpose of standing up that subacute therapy unit in Milledgeville. It's devoted to mental and behavioral health. It is necessary, and we owe it to those who've given us more than just their service. They've given us their lives. The bond package, probably where you guys turn first, is again this year being funded in cash. This is the third year in a row that we have saved Georgia taxpayer dollars by not mortgaging the future and instead placing these dollars into cash and funding them up front. That means for the next 17 years, people of our state, citizens of our state, should see savings based on interest savings due to the decisions made by Governor Kemp and others in this building. The Senate had a couple of additions here, mainly again related to the things you know in the past. You relate those to USG, you relate those to usually sometimes libraries. We helped fully fund the rebuild, we think right now it's the rebuild. We may end up with a different dollar at Valdosta to the library there. The library in Walton County, which was also in part of that swath of the storm on the edge, but affected by it. And then the Nell Brown Library in Lyons. The Senate also moved to add back $60 million to defeasance in the bond package. This is bonds that we use this money instead of bonding things to pay off bond debt earlier 2 years ago. The governor had used some of that money to pay storm damage early. We think it's important still and wise and prudent to go ahead and put that $60 million back to pay those bonds early and allow Georgians to receive the savings of taxes over the next, or of interest over the next 17 years while we still can do so. The high notes, I think I've hit most of the high notes, and looking at my little highlights, I think I've hit all my highlights. I'm happy to answer any other questions you have, but again, need to say thank you, especially to you subcommittee chairs, for the work you placed in this budget over the past roughly 16 days. And you were hampered. You were a little hindered by the fact that we could not have those joint meetings earlier, but you showed up, showed out like you always do, and created a budget that I think we can be proud of for our state as a whole. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them now, or I'll take a motion. Senator Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start out by saying I appreciate all the hard work you and your team have done on this budget. In relation to the hospital grant funding related to the hurricanes that you're moving to South Georgia, it's my understanding the original budget was to give all hospitals the opportunity, and wisely, I think, you moved it to the hospitals that would most likely be affected due to the hurricane. Remind me again, what was the original number and what's the number we landed on?
The original number was around 35 million. The landing number is around 14, and it's not just South Georgia. It is south up through East Georgia, up almost through Tacoma.
Right, I should say those impacted by the hurricane's path.
Yes,
but
sir.
so that's our cost savings went from, or our funding went from 35 down to 14.
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you.
Senator Beach.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for all your hard work and your staff's hard work. I did have one question, and that was about these modulars.
Yeah.
On 116.16, I was on a study committee with Whip Robinson this year, and it was amazing how bad some of our prisons are in bad shape as far as locks and so on. And I know the governor asked for 4, the House went to 2, and we're going to go to 3. Is there any way we could go to 4? What I'm scared of is the Department of Justice coming in here, and then we're going to have to be reactive instead of proactive. And I think it would be a good investment in our correction system. I just want to give my opinion on that. Is there any way we could put that 4th modular in a bond package of some sort to get all 4 of them, another 126 beds? I think it's that important.
Right. Well, remember, we don't have a bond package. We're funding it with cash.
Okay.
We could do so. It would mean moving another $23 million, I believe. And so we decided those dollars would be better spent on infrastructure and storm relief. But your point's well raised. You will hear, we had a separate meeting before session, as you know, somewhat unprecedented, related to corrections. And I think you heard from Chairman Hatchett pretty clearly that the timeline to replace locks is not acceptable to the legislature. We're not going to take years to replace locks. We need to replace locks now.
Okay. Thank you.
Senator Jones, Emmanuel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am looking at the governor's emergency fund request, $150 million.
Yeah.
And I noticed that the House is pretty close to being in agreement with the governor, but the Senate is a lot less. Can you expound on that, please?
Sure. If you look at the line right below it, we pulled $32 million out. If you add that $32 million in, you get right back to the House's number. That $32 million that came out, we combined with $50 additional million that we created through the savings I've already discussed to create an $82 million line item. specifically for local governments and state governments to pay our 25% share of FEMA match. Since the order did not extend and allow us to have 180 days of cleanup, the state of Georgia is now on the hook with its local governments for 25% of that money. And it's not fair to say that other states got it and we didn't. I can't go quite that far. The reason we only got 120 days instead of 180 days of cleanup is because the state of Georgia also asked for a 50% upfront payment. So our local governments are already receiving some of these funds rolling through. I'm just concerned, and I know many of this room are concerned, that the $32 million that was on the governor's line was not enough. So we actually added to that line and created a $82 million line.
Just one follow-up, Mr. Chairman.
Sure.
Is it unusual in cases like this of natural disasters for the federal government to deny coverage in those additional dollars from states?
I think so. Back in November, we asked the previous administration for an extension, and when we're denied, well, let's talk about originally out of the gate. So in September, when the storms happened, we were denied a 180-day extension that was given to Florida and to North Carolina in October. They were given 180 in October. We were given 120. I guess you would say, well, actually at the time we were given 90. I guess that could possibly be because we asked for the upfront monies instead. We asked for that again in November as the 90 days began to we saw it coming to an end. We asked the previous administration for an extension from that 90 days to 180 again. They said no and gave us a 120-day extension instead. When the new administration came in, we did ask for an extension that was not continued to 180, it was continued to 120, but we were given that extra prepayment that the local governments have received. So, yeah, I wish we could have gotten the 180 days originally back in October, but as you know, politics is what it was.
Thank you, Mr.
But that
Chairman.
was under a previous administration. Any further questions? Senator Sims. Can you hit your button so I can make sure we're...
Which one? Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Okay.
ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just as an observation, and thank you so much for as well as your staff for all of the hard work you've put into this. We have a huge investment in addiction behavior, which most times is by choice. And I don't want anybody to think that I'm insensitive, but what is the return on investment? And I have a deep interest in providing more money to educational programs, healthcare, those kinds of issues, as opposed to the amount of money that we're investing in addiction. And I was looking at the amount of money we're putting into drones for the prisons. That is a huge amount. So I don't know who the vendor is, whether it's going to work, but those are sincere concerns that I have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. If there are no other questions, we'll take a motion at the right time. A motion by Senator Robertson, second by Senator Walker. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Opposed? And it passes unanimously. Thank you so much for being here today. We are adjourned.